She read the notice twice before the words would hold still, and both times they said the same thing. Pay the note in full within the fortnight, or the farm passed to Josiah Crane at auction on the courthouse steps. 10 months now since her father had gone into the ground, felled by a wagon accident on the river road, and in all that time Clara had scraped by on stubbornness, and the little the farm yielded, telling herself each season that the next would be easier. It never was. The roof leaked in 3 places she hadn't the lumber to fix. The mule had gone lame in the spring and never come fully right. And beneath it all sat her father's note to Josiah Crane, taken out 2 winters back to buy seed after a hailstorm flattened the wheat. A debt she had paid down slow and steady, until Crane, without warning, called the whole balance due at once, as though he had been waiting all along for the moment it would hurt her most. Clara Whitfield set the paper down on the kitchen table as though it might scorch her fingers if she held it a moment longer. Across from her, Crane sat with his hat still on his head, which her father would never have allowed in his own house, and smiled the smile of a man who had already spent the money in his mind. "There's another way, of course," he said. "My Wendells asked after you for a year now. Marry the boy, and I'd be glad to forgive what your father owed. Call it a wedding gift." Clara looked past him, out the window, to where her 12-year-old brother Tommy was mending a fence rail with the careful, silent concentration he brought to everything since the fever had taken his hearing 3 winters back. He could not hear the offer being made over his future. She was glad of that, at least. "I'll find another way," she said. "There isn't one." Crane rose, unhurried, and settled his hat lower. 14 days, Miss Whitfield. I'd hate to see you and the boy out in the weather." When his buggy had rattled off down the lane, Clara stood a long while at the window with her arms wrapped around herself, doing the arithmetic she had already done 100 times. Her father's debts, the bank in cross timbers that would not extend credit to a woman alone, the neighbors too poor themselves to lend, or too afraid of crossing Crane, who held half the county's paper. There was no one. Except, perhaps, the one man in the territory that Crane did not own and did not frighten. She had never spoken to Malcolm York. Nobody had, not really, not in the 8 years since his wife and infant son had died of the fever up at Raven Ridge, and he had gone from a laughing young rancher to a shadow that rode the high pastures alone and came to town only for supplies, buying quickly and leaving before anyone could ask him a question he didn't want to answer. The stories about him had calcified into something between gossip and superstition. He hadn't ridden for the doctor in time, some said. He'd locked his wife in the fever room and let her die rather than risk himself, others said, though no 2 versions agreed, which was itself a kind of proof that none of them were true. Children dared each other to ride past his gate. Women warned their daughters off the Raven Ridge road entirely. He was also, by every account, the richest independent rancher within 40 miles, beholden to no bank and no man like Crane. She thought of Hattie Combs, the storekeeper's wife, who had pulled her aside after church only a month back to warn her off the Raven Ridge road entirely. "That man's got a darkness in him, Clara. Whatever business you might think you have up that way, find another road to it." Clara had promised she would, meaning it at the time, before she had a fortnight and no other road left to find. Clara pressed her palms flat against the table and made herself breathe. Then she went and found Tommy and signed to him with the quick hands he had taught her, faster than she could speak. "I have to go see about the farm. Stay close to the house." He looked at her for a long moment, reading something in her face that she hadn't meant to show him, then nodded and went back to his fence rail. She hitched the mule cart herself and drove north. The Raven Ridge road climbed through stands of blue spruce that shut out the afternoon sun in long, cool bars, and by the time the ranch house came into view sound, well kept, a good deal finer than she'd expected of a man everyone called half-mad. Her hands had gone stiff on the reins from gripping them too hard. She made herself climb down before her nerve could fail her. He came around the corner of the barn before she reached the porch, and she understood in the same instant why the stories persisted. He was a big man, unshaven, dressed like a hand rather than the owner of 4,000 acres, and he stopped dead at the sight of her, the way a man stops who has trained himself not to expect visitors. His eyes were the pale gray-blue of a winter sky, and there was something wary and closed in them that had nothing to do with anger, and everything to do with a wound that had never properly healed. "You're lost," he said. It was not quite a question. "I'm not." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I'm Clara Whitfield. My father's farm borders Crane's land on the South Fork. He's called the note due, and if I can't pay it in a fortnight, Crane takes the farm or I marry his son to save it." Malcolm's jaw tightened at Crane's name, the only flicker of feeling she'd seen in him yet. That's a hard thing to tell a stranger. "I haven't finished." She made herself go on before her courage failed entirely. "I've got a brother, 12 years old, deaf since the fever and nowhere else in this world to take him. I came to ask if you'd marry me instead. A paper marriage. I'd keep your house, cook, mend, and be glad of the work, and you'd pay what's owed and never have to explain yourself to me or anybody. I know what they say about you. I don't care what they say about you. I care that you're the one man in this county Josiah Crane can't touch." For a long moment, he only looked at her, and she made herself hold still under it, refusing to drop her eyes the way half the town did when he passed. "You don't know me," he said finally. "No," she agreed, "but I know Crane, and I'd rather bind myself to a stranger than to that family." Something almost like a rueful smile moved at the corner of his mouth, gone before she could be sure of it. "That's not much of a compliment to either of us." "It's the truth, though." "What's the boy's name?" "Tommy. He's 12 and clever with his hands, and he'll do a full day's work for you, deaf or not. I'll not have anyone treat him as less on account of what the fever took from him." "I'd never," Malcolm said, and something in the flat, immediate certainty of it told her more about the man than any of the stories had. "I know what it is to be looked at like you're less than whole. I'll not do that to a boy in my own house." He was quiet so long she thought she'd lost, and began composing in her mind the words she'd say to Crane instead. Then Malcolm said low, "I'd want the boy here too, and I'd want it understood I won't ask more of you than the bargain says. Not now. Not later, unless you'd have it different." "That's understood," she said, and something in her chest, some fist that had been clenched since the notice arrived, loosened by half an inch. "Reverend Cole will do it quiet if I ask him," Malcolm said. "I'll ride to Crane myself and settle the note before the ink's dry on the license, so he's got no cause to claim you owe him anything else." "Why would you do this for a stranger?" He looked away from her, out toward the ridge that gave the place its name, and for a moment she saw past the beard and the wariness to a much younger man who had once, she guessed, been easy and open before grief had shut every door in him. "Because I know what it is to have no one stand up when you need it," he said. "I'll not be the reason it happens to somebody else, not when it's in my power to stop it." They were married 4 days later in the front room of Reverend Cole's house, with Tommy standing witness, and signing his approval with both thumbs up the moment the Reverend pronounced them wed, which was the first time Clara had laughed in a month. As they came out onto the porch after, she was startled to find Wendell Crane himself waiting at the gate, hat in hand, looking younger and less sure of himself than she had ever seen him at his father's side. "I only wanted to say I'm glad of it," he said, awkward, not quite meeting her eyes. "I never asked Pa to force the matter the way he did. I'd have courted you honest if you'd have wanted it, but I'll not pretend I'm sorry to see you spared marrying into that house on his terms instead of your own." He set a small parcel on the gate-post. "A jar of his late mother's preserves," he said, the only kind thing he had to give, and rode off before she could properly thank him, leaving her to wonder whether the whole Crane family was quite as simple as the father's cruelty made them appear. Malcolm rode to Crane's place that same afternoon and paid the note in full in cash, and did not stay to hear whatever Crane had to say about it. When he came back to Raven Ridge at dusk, he found Clara on the porch waiting, unsure of her welcome in a house that was now, on paper, her own. "It's done," he said. "The land's clear." "Thank you." She meant it more than the two words could hold. He nodded, awkward as a boy, and went to see to the horse. And that was the whole of their wedding night. A fed stock and a quiet house and two people, who were now strangers married rather than strangers unmarried, which Clara told herself was progress enough. The town did not agree that any progress had been made at all. Word of the marriage ran ahead of them into Raven Ridge's small crossroads settlement faster than Clara could have carried it herself, and the first Sunday she and Malcolm walked into services together, the front pews found urgent business studying their hymnals rather than greeting the bride. She felt the weight of it like a hand pressed against her back, and beside her she felt Malcolm go rigid, braced the way a man braces for a blow he has taken so many times he no longer flinches, only endures. "They'll come around," she said under her breath, not at all certain it was true. "They won't," he said without bitterness, only a flat and long-worn certainty. "Best you know that now, before you've hitched your name to it." Outside, after, Hattie Combs caught her arm with the particular gentleness people use for someone they consider already half-ruined. "You've married yourself to grief, Clara. I hope the farm was worth it." "He's kinder to me in a month than most of this town's been in a year," Clara said, more sharply than she meant to, and walked on before Hattie could answer, her face burning the whole ride home. She said nothing of it to Malcolm. He had carried that particular weight long enough without her adding her own portion of it to his shoulders. But she found, in the weeks that followed, that the man the town feared bore almost no resemblance to the man she lived beside. He rose before dawn to see to the stock, and always had coffee going by the time she came down, though he'd never say so and would only grunt if she thanked him. He built Tommy a proper writing slate, and without being asked, spent 3 evenings teaching himself enough of the hand signs Clara used with her brother that he could tell the boy good morning, and well done in his own halting way, which made Tommy grin so wide it near split his face. He was patient with the green colt nobody else on the place would handle, patient with the cranky old sow, patient in 100 small ways with a life that had given him every reason to be otherwise. When a spring calf came early and weak, and its mother would not claim it, Malcolm sat up 3 nights running in the barn with the shivering thing wrapped in his own coat, and would not hear of giving up on it even when his hand, old Wit, said plainly, it wasn't worth the trouble. The calf lived, and grew into a bawling, affectionate nuisance that followed Malcolm around the yard like a dog, and Clara found she could not watch the two of them together without something in her chest going soft and unguarded. He mended a neighbor's washed-out culvert on a night he thought no one would know it was his doing, and only admitted it when Clara found the borrowed shovel still in the wagon bed the next morning. He never once raised his voice at Tommy, not even the day the boy let the geese loose into the vegetable patch, and when Tommy signed his own apology, red-faced and near tears, Malcolm knelt down to his eye level and signed back, slow and careful with his big unpracticed hands, "No matter, we'll fix it together." And Tommy had hugged him so hard and so sudden that Malcolm looked, for one unguarded moment, like a man remembering exactly what it felt like to be needed. "You're not what they say," Clara told him one evening, watching him splint a lamb's leg by lantern light with hands far too big and far too gentle for the work. "Folks believe what's easiest to believe," he said, not looking up. "Easier to believe a grieving man's a monster than to sit with the notion that grief just is what it is and could happen to any of them." "What did happen?" she asked, and then quickly, "You needn't answer, I've no right to ask it." He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't. Then, "Marta took sick of a fever in the night, our boy not 3 months old. I rode for Doc Ferris myself, hard as I've ever ridden anything, and the river was up over the ford from 3 days' rain, and I lost an hour finding a crossing. By the time I brought him back, it was too late for both of them. Doc told the town straight out I'd done everything a man could do. But grief doesn't listen to a doctor's word, and neither did the town. Easier to say I'd failed them than to admit sometimes a river rises, and a fever comes, and there's no fault to lay anywhere at all." "That's not a monster's story," Clara said quietly. "That's the saddest story I ever heard." "Sad's not the same as safe," he said. "I've not trusted myself close to anyone since, for fear of losing them too. Better a house with no one in it to lose." "There's people in it now," she said, "Tommy and me." He looked at her then, really looked, in a way that made her feel seen clean through for the first time since her father died, and said nothing at all, because there was nothing yet that either of them was ready to say. Late that summer, the Crossroads Church held its harvest social, and Clara went only because Tommy begged to, certain the whole evening would be an ordeal of cold shoulders and whispering. It was, at first. But when the fiddler struck up a reel, and no one asked her to dance, Malcolm, who she had never once seen so much as sway to music, crossed the whole barn floor in front of everyone and held out his hand. "I don't dance," he said low, only for her. "Haven't in 8 years, but I'll not have my wife stand against the wall on my account." He was clumsy and solemn and counted his steps under his breath, and Clara laughed until her sides ached, and by the third turn around the floor, 2 other couples had joined them. And by the end of the evening, even Hattie Combs's husband had clapped Malcolm once, briefly, on the shoulder. A small thing, a nothing, except that it was the first time in 8 years anyone in that room had touched him without flinching first. Riding home under a sky gone thick with stars, Clara rested her head against his shoulder and felt him go still with surprise, and then, slowly, relax into it, his arm coming around her to steady her against the wagon sway. "I used to think I'd used up whatever luck I had," he said into the dark, "on Marta, on our boy, and that whatever came after was owed to me as a debt for it. I don't think that anymore. I think you were the luck I hadn't had yet." She didn't answer him in words. She only turned her face up and let him kiss her, soft and unhurried, the first time either of them had allowed the bargain between them to become something neither of them had bargained for at all. She might have let it rest there, a slow thaw with no need for hurry, if Josiah Crane had been willing to let his defeat stand. He was not. Within a month, word came through the mercantile that Crane was telling anyone who'd listen that the note he'd been paid off on had been improperly transferred years back from a neighboring claim, and that a portion of the Whitfield Farm's South Fork actually sat on Crane land by an old survey error. An error he intended to have a judge in Cross Timbers correct in his favor. It was transparent thievery dressed up as law, but Crane had money enough to make even thin law hold, and everyone in the county knew it. "He means to take it a different way, since marrying didn't buy it for him," Malcolm said grimly. Over the survey papers Clara's father had kept in a trunk since before she was born. "Can he do it?" "Not if we can prove the old line before his hired surveyor does his measuring." Malcolm rubbed a hand over his jaw. I know an old freighter, Ezra Combs, surveyed that fork 20 years back for the county himself. If he's living, and if he'll swear to it, Crane's claim falls apart. It took them a week of hard riding to find Ezra Combs, retired now to a cabin 2 days east, and another 2 days to bring him back. An old man glad enough of the outing and the coin Malcolm pressed on him, who remembered the true line clear as anything, and was willing to say so before God and a judge both. On the road home, 2 of Crane's hired men crossed their path at a narrow creek ford, making a show of blocking the way, and asking loudly where a rancher like Malcolm thought he was hauling an old drunk fool. But Malcolm only sat his horse steady, unbothered, and said that Ezra Combs was a guest of Raven Ridge riding under his protection, and that any man who cared to test what that meant was welcome to try. Something in his stillness must have carried more weight than a raised voice would have, because the 2 men let them pass with nothing worse than muttering, and Clara understood then, watching him, that the gentleness she had come to know in her own kitchen, sat right alongside a steel Crane, would have done well to reckon with sooner. Through all of it Clara rode beside Malcolm, rather than waiting at home, refusing to be the delicate thing he might have expected. And by the time they turned back toward Raven Ridge with Ezra Combs snoring in the wagon bed behind them, something had settled between the 2 of them that no marriage paper had managed on its own in ease. A partnership, a habit of glancing sideways at each other in a hard moment, and finding the other one already looking back. "You didn't have to come," Malcolm said, on the last night of the ride, the fire down to coals and Ezra's snores rising steady from the wagon. "I did, though," she said. "It's my farm, too, near enough, and it's my husband riding into a fight I helped bring on him." "You didn't bring Crane down on anybody. He was a grasping man long before he ever met you." "Maybe, but I'll not sit home and let you carry it alone regardless." She looked at him across the fire, feeling bolder than she had any right to feel, married 4 weeks to a man she was still learning. "You said once you'd not trust yourself close to anyone for fear of losing them. I think you're closer to me than you meant to let yourself get, Malcolm York." He didn't deny it. He only looked at her a long moment, the firelight moving gold across that wary, wounded, gentle face, and said, quiet as a confession, "I think I am. God help me, I think I am, and I don't know what to do about it except be afraid." "Don't be afraid of me," she said. "Be afraid of Crane if you've got to be afraid of somebody. I'm not going anywhere." He reached across the small distance between them and took her hand, the first time he had, and held it as though it were something rare and easily broken, and neither of them said anything more, because, for the first time, neither of them needed to. Crane, when he learned that Ezra Combs was riding back to swear his survey before a judge, did not take the news quietly. He was a man who had built a fortune on other men's desperation, and had never once, in all his grasping years, been beaten by anyone poorer than himself, and the notion that a scarred recluse and a farm widow's daughter had bested him was more than his pride could bear. He came to Raven Ridge himself 2 nights before the circuit judge was due, with 4 hired men and a wagon of coal oil, under a sky already heavy with the season's first real storm. Clara woke to Tommy's hand shaking her shoulder hard, his face white in the dark, pointing frantically toward the window, where the barn showed a wrong orange glow against the black. "Malcolm!" She was out of bed and into the hall before she'd fully understood what she was shouting about, and found him already at the window, already reaching for his boots. "Get Tommy to the root cellar and bar the door," he said, low and fast. No trace left of the wary, quiet man she'd married, only a man moving to defend what was his. "Whatever you hear, you stay down there till I come for you myself." "Malcolm!" "Please, Clara." His hand cupped her face for one bare second, rough and cold and shaking faintly. "I've lost people to fire and fever both. I'll not lose you to it too. Let me do this." She got Tommy down the cellar steps with her heart hammering fit to break her ribs, but she did not bar the door behind them, not entirely. She left it a hand's width open, because some strength in her that had grown over the last month refused to sit blind in the dark, while her husband faced 4 armed men alone. What she heard, crouched at the top of the cellar steps with Tommy pressed silent and trusting against her side, was shouting, and the scream of a horse, and Malcolm's voice raised in a fury she had never once heard from him, ordering Crane's men off his land. She heard Crane's voice too, high and ugly, saying the fire would take the barn and the house both if Malcolm didn't sign the South Fork over that very night. She heard a shot, and her whole body went to ice, and she was up the steps and out into the yard before sense could catch up with her legs. The rain had begun, hard and sudden, hissing against the barn's blazing roof, and in its wild orange light she saw Malcolm on the ground, one of Crane's men standing over him with a raised rifle butt, and without a thought in her head beyond stopping it, she seized the yard's water bucket and swung it with all her strength into the man's shoulder, knocking him off his aim long enough for Malcolm to roll clear and come up with his own gun drawn. "Get back in the house," he shouted at her, but it was too late for that, and she would not have gone regardless. The first to arrive, astonishingly, was Wendell Crane, riding bareback and half-dressed, who had overheard his father's men loading the coal oil wagon and ridden ahead of them the whole way to give warning, only to arrive just as the flames caught. He threw himself off his horse and into the bucket line beside Clara without a word of explanation needed, and when his own father rounded on him, furious, demanding to know whose son he thought he was, Wendell said, loud enough for the whole yard to hear over the rain, "Not yours, Pa, not for this," and kept hauling water. It was the neighbors who turned the tide after him, men and women from the same Crossroads church that had frozen Clara out on her first Sunday, roused by the glow of the fire against the storm clouds, and come riding hard with buckets and shovels, and in a few cases, their own long guns, because whatever they had believed of Malcolm York in the abstract, they had watched him all these weeks feed a widow's family and teach a deaf boy his letters, and pay a debt out of pure decency. And it turned out that was harder to hate than a rumor. Hattie Combs herself came with a lantern in one hand and her husband's old shotgun in the other, and when she passed Clara in the chaos, she gripped her arm and said, low and shamed, "I was wrong about him. I'm sorry for it," which was as near to an apology as the woman had in her, and Clara found she had no room left that night for anything but gratitude that it had come at all. Crane's hired men, faced suddenly with a dozen armed neighbors and the man's own son turned against him, lost their taste for the job and lit out into the storm. And Josiah Crane himself was left standing alone in his own guilt, with the rain pouring down his upturned collar, and no lie left big enough to cover him. Malcolm had taken the rifle butt hard across the ribs before Clara reached him in the yard, and for 2 days after the fire he lay abed grudging every hour of it, insisting he had work to see to, while Clara pressed cool cloths to the bruising and refused to let him so much as sit up unassisted. "You've tended near everyone else on this place back to health," she told him, firm as she'd ever been with him. "Let somebody tend you for once, and don't argue." He argued anyway, out of habit more than conviction, but he let her fuss over him regardless, and there was a tenderness in the letting that told her more plainly than any words could that the wariness in him was finally, truly beginning to close over like a healed wound. The circuit judge, arriving 2 days later than planned on account of the washed-out roads, set up his bench in the schoolhouse and heard Ezra Combs's sworn survey read into the record word for word, heard a dozen witnesses to the fire and the threat besides, Hattie Combs and her husband, and 3 others who had ridden out that night among them, and did not merely dismiss Crane's claim on the South Fork. He referred the matter of arson and armed threat to the territorial marshal on the spot, remarking dryly, for the whole courtroom to hear, that he had rarely seen a man's own neighbors turn out so thoroughly against him, and that it generally meant something. Josiah Crane's grasping reach over that county shrank considerably before the year was out, and Wendell, freed at last of his father's debts and his father's schemes both, took up honest work of his own, and came to call at Raven Ridge now and again, as a welcome friend rather than a reluctant suitor. The barn was rebuilt by spring, half the county turning out to raise the new frame in a single long, loud, cheerful day that Clara would remember all her life, as the moment Raven Ridge stopped being the place folks feared and became simply home. Malcolm worked alongside his neighbors with his sleeves rolled and his rare, unguarded smile showing more than once. And that evening, with the new boards still pale and raw against the old stone foundation, he found Clara alone on the porch and took both her hands in his. "I married you to save a farm," she said, before he could speak. "And I told myself that was the whole of it, for as long as I could make myself believe it. And now I'd marry you all over again for no reason, but that I love you, Malcolm York, and I'll not pretend otherwise one more day." "I loved you before I let myself say the word," he admitted, low, his thumbs moving over her knuckles. "I was afraid of it a long while, afraid loving anybody again was asking to be broken twice. But you and Tommy walked into this house and made it a home again, and I find I'm not afraid anymore. Not of losing you, only of a life without you in it." He kissed her then, gentle and sure, with the whole rebuilt barn standing behind them and the ridge going gold in the last of the evening light. And Tommy, watching from the doorway, signed something with both hands that needed no voice at all to be understood by either of them. About time. That night, after Tommy had gone up to bed and the house had settled into its familiar creaking quiet, Malcolm brought out a small tin box Clara had never seen him open, and from it drew a faded daguerreotype of a young woman with a laughing, gentle face and a baby swaddled in her arms. "I've kept this shut away 8 years," he said. "Couldn't look at it and couldn't throw it out either. I want you to see it, though. I want you to know her a little, since she was part of what made me the man you married, same as this ridge and this house were." Clara took the little picture with careful hands and looked a long while at Marta York's kind, unremarkable, entirely ordinary face, and felt no jealousy in it at all, only a quiet gratitude toward a stranger she would never meet, who had loved this good man first and taught him, before grief ever touched him, how to be gentle. "Thank you for showing me," she said, and meant it. "I'll not ask you to put her away for my sake. There's room enough in a heart this size for both a grief and a gladness." He folded her hand and the picture together inside both of his, and for a while they simply sat that way, the lamp burning low, the ridge gone dark outside the window, 2 people who had come together for the plainest, most practical of reasons and found, against every hard fact of the county's gossip, something neither of them had thought still possible for a widower's ruined heart or a debt-poor widow's daughter. Clara Whitfield had ridden to Raven Ridge a desperate stranger, seeking only a name to shield her brother and a roof to keep the winter out. She left that porch, years later in her memory, though it was only that one evening, certain of something far larger, that the feared recluse of Raven Ridge had never once, in all the county's telling, been the man they warned each other about, and that the truest kindness in that whole hard country had been waiting quietly for her at the top of a lonely road, all alone.